The geographical reality of the Gulf of Salerno in the late summer of 1943 presented a perfect paradox of natural beauty and lethal military architecture. As Generaloberst Heinrich von Vietinghoff, the battle-hardened commander of the German 10th Army, surveyed the crescent-shaped coastline from his elevated command posts deep within the jagged limestone foothills of the Apennine Mountains, he recognized the terrain not as a picturesque Italian seascape but as a meticulously designed kill zone. The coastal plain stretching below him was a narrow shelf of agricultural land hemmed in by an imposing continuous ring of high ground. For an amphibious invasion force, this amphitheater represented a tactical nightmare. The defending forces occupying the heights possessed an unassailable vantage point, offering perfect observation and interlocking fields of fire that could completely dominate the beaches and the shallow plains below. Vietinghoff, a pragmatist steeped in the rigorous aggressive doctrines of the Prussian military tradition, had strategically positioned the veteran elements of the 16th Panzer Division to exploit this precise topographical trap. Following the sudden political collapse of the Axis alliance with Italy and the subsequent secret armistice, the German High Command knew an Allied landing was imminent. When the vast armada of the American Fifth Army, commanded by Lieutenant General Mark Clark, materialized out of the pre-dawn darkness on September 9, Operation Avalanche was set into motion and Vietinghoff's grand operational trap was sprung. The initial phases of the Allied landing seemed to validate every defensive calculation Vietinghoff had made. In a highly controversial and ultimately disastrous attempt to achieve tactical surprise, the Allied planners had explicitly canceled the customary preliminary naval bombardment. The assault waves of the American 36th Infantry Division and the British 46th and 56th Divisions approached the designated landing zones at Paestum and Maiori under a cloak of heavy silence. But the German defenders, deeply entrenched in terraced olive groves, fortified stone farmhouses, and poured concrete bunkers, were merely waiting for the landing craft to drop their ramps. When they finally opened fire, the result was an organized mechanical slaughter. German heavy machine guns, mortar batteries, and devastating 88mm anti-aircraft guns, depressed to fire horizontally, swept the beaches with interlocking trajectories of high explosive and armor-piercing ordnance. Despite suffering catastrophic casualties in the surf and on the sand, the sheer numerical weight and desperate courage of the Allied infantry allowed them to claw their way off the beaches and establish a tenuous, disjointed perimeter. However, Vietinghoff remained entirely unbothered by this initial lodgment. His overarching strategy was never to rigidly contest the waterline where his forces would be exposed to the guns of the fleet. Instead, his doctrine dictated a dynamic defense in depth. He deliberately allowed the Allied logistical train to bottleneck on the contested sand, drawing the invading forces deeper into the geographical bowl, stretching their fragile supply lines and forcing them to commit their limited armor to the marshy, restricting terrain of the coastal shelf. By the 13th of September, the operational situation for the Allied beachhead had deteriorated into a state of profound terminal crisis. A massive fatal seam had developed in the center of the Allied lines along the muddy, meandering banks of the Selle River, which served as the boundary between the British 10th Corps to the north and the American 6th Corps to the south. This geographical gap, expanding to nearly 5 miles in width, presented a vulnerability so severe that it threatened to unhinge the entire invasion. Vietinghoff, recognizing the precise moment of maximum Allied disorganization, unleashed his mechanized reserves. The German counterattack was a masterclass in combined arms maneuver warfare, orchestrated with the ruthless efficiency that characterized the Wehrmacht. Formations of Panzer IV medium tanks supported by heavily armored self-propelled assault guns and elite panzergrenadiers riding in armored half-tracks surged down the Selle River corridor. The Panzer IV, powered by a massive Maybach V12 engine and armed with a high-velocity 75mm gun, completely outclassed the scattered, lightly equipped American infantry desperately trying to hold the line. The German objective was absolute: to sever the beachhead cleanly and to isolate the British and American sectors and systematically drive the divided remnants violently back into the Tyrrhenian Sea. As the armored spearheads overran forward observation posts, crushed machine gun nests, and drove deep into the rear echelon areas, American command posts were abandoned in panic and vital supply dumps were incinerated to prevent capture. General Clark, anticipating total annihilation, ordered his staff to prepare emergency contingency plans for a full evacuation of the Fifth Army. The German tank commanders, operating miles inland and shielded from the coastline by rolling hills and dense vegetation, felt entirely secure in their tactical dominance. They were advancing beyond the effective range of the limited American field artillery that had been landed, and the coastal topography effectively masked their movements from the direct visual line of sight of the naval vessels anchored in the distant bay. They believed they were fighting a traditional continental land battle where their superiority in armored mass and maneuver would inevitably secure the victory. But as the 16th Panzer Division marshaled its heavy elements for the final crushing blow against the collapsing American lines, they were about to encounter a terrifying paradigm shift in the physics of warfare. They were about to be subjected to an unprecedented, overwhelming volume of invisible fire originating from floating steel fortresses they could not see, directed by observers they could not hear. Realizing the survival of the entire invasion hung by a thread, the Allied naval commanders ordered every available cruiser and destroyer to close the shoreline, dropping anchor in dangerously shallow waters to provide continued, unrestricted emergency naval gunfire support. The United States Navy deployed a powerful squadron of light cruisers, including the Savannah, the Philadelphia, and the Boise, while the Royal Navy moved the cruisers Mauritius, Uganda, and Orion into position alongside a flotilla of aggressive fleet destroyers. These vessels were not merely transport escorts, they were highly mobile, heavily armored artillery batteries capable of delivering a volume of high-explosive ordnance that no land-based artillery regiment in the world could possibly sustain. A Brooklyn-class cruiser like the Savannah was a marvel of industrial naval architecture, displacing over 10,000 tons and armed with 15 6-inch 47 caliber guns arranged in 5 massive triple turrets. The mechanics of these weapons were terrifying. Firing automatically hydraulic rammers shoved 50-pound silk bags of smokeless powder behind 130-pound high-explosive projectiles, sending them out of the rifled barrels at supersonic velocities exceeding 2,800 feet per second. A single cruiser could sustain a continuous cyclic rate of fire of nearly 150 rounds per minute, blanketing a grid square with thousands of pounds of razor-sharp shrapnel and concussive blast overpressure in a matter of seconds. But the sheer mechanical violence of these naval rifles was entirely useless without highly precise targeting data. The German armored formations were assembling in hidden defilades and deep valleys entirely obscured from the optics of the ships. To bridge this critical tactical gap, the Allies deployed a highly sophisticated integrated network of forward observers and specialized aviation assets, completely transforming the airspace above Salerno into a mathematically calculated grid of destruction. On the ground, brave naval liaison officers carrying heavy specialized radio transmitters crawled to the crests of the contested hills, risking enemy sniper fire and mortar barrages to establish visual contact with the German staging areas. Simultaneously, the sky above the battlefield was populated by specialized naval spotter aircraft. Slow-flying Supermarine Seafires and Curtiss Society Seagull floatplanes, catapulted directly from the decks of the cruisers, circled high above the smoke and dust of the active front lines. These naval aviators, flying completely unarmed and highly vulnerable to roaming Luftwaffe fighter patrols, acted as the indispensable eyes of the fleet. They observed the massive columns of German armor churning up the dust of the coastal roads and instantly translated those visual observations into complex mathematical coordinates based on standardized military grid reference systems. The communication loop between the airborne spotters and the naval gunners operating deep within the armored citadels of the cruisers was a triumph of mid-century analog engineering. The pilot would transmit the exact grid coordinates and a brief description of the target via highly scrambled, very high-frequency radio signals. These signals were received by the plotting rooms, where teams of highly trained fire control technicians fed the raw numbers into electromechanical analog computers known as rangekeepers. The rangekeeper was an incredibly complex arrangement of interlocking gears, precision cams, and electrical servomotors designed specifically to solve real-time ballistic differential equations. The technicians inputted a dizzying array of variable data to ensure absolute mathematical accuracy. They factored in the exact distance to the targeted panzer formation, the speed and course of the firing ship, the ambient temperature of the smokeless powder, the atmospheric humidity, the barometric pressure, the rotational effect of the Earth known as the Coriolis drift, and even the microscopic internal wear on the rifling inside the gun barrels from previous fire missions. Once the rangekeeper digested and synthesized these variables, it transmitted continuous electrical signals directly to the heavy gun turrets, automatically elevating and traversing the massive steel cannons to the precise geometric angle required to deliver the shells over the intervening mountains and directly onto the unseen German positions. The synchronization between the ship, the spotter, and the guns was absolute. When the command to fire was given, the cruiser would shudder violently, laterally displacing tons of seawater as the propellant ignited simultaneously in massive blinding flashes of orange flame. For the German soldiers of the 16th Panzer Division advancing confidently through the Selle River Gap, the arrival of this ordnance was an incomprehensible mechanical apocalypse. They were highly accustomed to the rhythmic, predictable nature of traditional field artillery, which required time to register targets and adjust fire, allowing infantry a brief window to seek cover in trenches or craters. Naval gunfire possessed no such rhythm and offered no such mercy. Because the massive shells were traveling at supersonic speeds far faster than the speed of sound, they arrived entirely without warning. The air above the German columns would suddenly split apart with the deafening shriek of violently displaced atmosphere, followed a microsecond later by a cataclysmic series of overlapping detonations that tore the earth open. General Vietinghoff, receiving increasingly frantic and confused radio transmissions from his frontline battalion commanders, struggled to comprehend the sheer scale of the destruction being reported from units that were supposed to be advancing unopposed. Entire companies of elite panzer grenadiers assembling in supposedly secure rear areas miles from the front lines were being instantly vaporized. The 6-inch high-explosive naval shells equipped with highly sensitive super-quick-point detonating fuses did not bury themselves deep in the dirt before exploding like standard artillery. They detonated at the exact millimeter of contact with the hard ground or the dense canopy of the ancient olive trees, sending horizontal scythes of jagged steel fragments tearing through the vulnerable, unarmored sides of half-tracks and the supply trucks carrying vital aviation fuel and heavy ammunition. The sheer kinetic energy of a naval shell striking a medium tank like a Panzer IV was enough to completely shatter the armored chassis, dismount the heavy turret from its traverse ring, and instantly incinerate the crew within, regardless of whether the shell actually penetrated the main armor plate. The psychological impact of this bombardment was as devastating to the German cohesion as the physical destruction of their machines. Hardened German veterans of the brutal Eastern Front who had endured the massive rocket artillery barrages of the Soviet Red Army reported that they had never experienced anything remotely comparable to the sheer density, relentless volume, and absolute mathematical accuracy of the Allied naval bombardment at Salerno. The invisible fire completely paralyzed the German counterattack. Every time a German armored column attempted to maneuver down a coastal road or deploy from a marching column into a combat formation, an airborne spotter would instantly relay the movement, and within 3 minutes a devastating concentration of naval artillery would obliterate the exact coordinate. The precision of the naval gunners was truly surgical. Desperate American forward observers called in danger close fire missions within 200 yards of their own fragile defensive lines, trusting the absolute ballistic accuracy of the fleet to break up the advancing German infantry assaults. The United States Sixth Corps, which mere hours earlier had been on the verge of a catastrophic collapse, suddenly found its front lines protected by an impenetrable continuous curtain of high-explosive steel dropping vertically from the sky. The massive German thrust down the Selle River corridor, which Vietinghoff had staked his entire operational strategy upon to split the beachhead, was violently and permanently blunted. The burned-out husks of German armor and shattered transport vehicles littered the valley floors, standing as silent, smoking testaments to the lethal, unprecedented reach of sea power projecting deep inland. But the nightmare for the German 10th Army was only beginning to reach its zenith. The cruisers and destroyers had stabilized the defensive perimeter, but the Allied High Command, determined to permanently break the German will to resist, called upon the ultimate strategic arbiters of naval destruction. On the morning of September 14, as the surviving German infantry attempted to regroup under the relentless 6-inch barrage, 2 massive gray silhouettes appeared on the distant horizon. They were the British Queen Elizabeth-class battleships Warspite and Valiant, legendary veterans of the First World War that had been extensively modernized to serve as the heavy strategic hammers of the Royal Navy. Their arrival instantly shifted the scale of the bombardment from tactical battlefield interdiction to outright geographic annihilation. Unlike the light cruisers, which relied on a rapid, saturating volume of fire, the battleships delivered localized seismic events. Each colossal vessel was armed with 8 15-inch Mark I naval guns firing armor-piercing and high-explosive projectiles that weighed 1,920 pounds, roughly the weight of a small automobile. The operational employment of these massive strategic weapons required entirely different ballistic considerations. The 15-inch shells, propelled by over 400 pounds of highly volatile cordite, traveled at 2,400 feet per second and reached maximum altitudes of thousands of feet before plunging back to Earth on a terrifying steep parabolic trajectory. This plunging fire was originally engineered to defeat heavily fortified concrete coastal bunkers and the thick horizontal deck armor of enemy dreadnoughts, but when applied to soft ground targets, the results were completely apocalyptic. When a 15-inch high-explosive shell struck the Italian soil, it did not merely fragment, it excavated the terrain. The resulting detonation created craters 30 feet wide and 15 feet deep, displacing hundreds of tons of earth, rock, and vegetation in a single blinding microsecond. The concussive overpressure generated by the massive blast wave was sufficient to instantly rupture the internal organs of infantrymen sheltering in deep defensive trenches hundreds of feet from the actual epicenter of the explosion. As Vietinghoff desperately attempted to reinforce the battered, bleeding remnants of the 16th Panzer Division holding the critical commanding high ground around the village of Altavilla, the British battleships received their highly refined firing coordinates. The village, sitting atop a steep strategic ridge, was heavily garrisoned by German troops preparing for a final renewed assault on the American lines. The airborne spotter planes verified the target, and the massive electromechanical rangekeepers aboard Warspite and Valiant calculated the complex firing solution. When the battleships finally unleashed their broadsides, the immense physical concussion was felt miles inland, rattling the windows of the German command posts. The massive shells arced high over the Gulf of Salerno, completely invisible to the naked eye until the very fraction of a second before impact. The bombardment of Altavilla was a display of mechanized violence that defied human comprehension. Entire stone buildings that had stood for centuries were instantly pulverized into fine gray dust in a single direct strike. Heavy German armored vehicles caught in the immediate blast radius were thrown violently through the air like discarded toys, their heavily armored welded hulls crushed inward by the sheer atmospheric pressure of the detonations. The stark strategic reality of the invisible fire finally broke the operational momentum and the fighting spirit of the German 10th Army. A general can tactically maneuver his forces against an enemy he can see, he can develop specialized countermeasures against tanks and infantry, he can even deploy massed anti-aircraft batteries to contest the skies above his troops. But Vietinghoff realized with a deep creeping sense of professional despair that he possessed absolutely no mechanism to counter the massive guns of the Allied fleet. His land-based field artillery could not possibly range the heavily armored ships anchored miles offshore. His Luftwaffe assets were heavily outnumbered and unable to penetrate the dense Allied combat air patrols to strike the vessels, and his vaunted panzer divisions, the premier instrument of German operational maneuver, were being systematically slaughtered in their staging areas without ever seeing the enemy that was destroying them. The traditional military geometry of the battlefield had been fundamentally altered forever. The coastline was no longer a secure flank that could be anchored, it was a porous, vulnerable membrane through which the Allies could project overwhelming, unlimited firepower deep into the continental hinterland. By the evening of September 15, the grand German counteroffensive had completely and permanently stalled. The casualty reports flooding into Vietinghoff's headquarters from the front lines were staggering and unsustainable. Elite veteran infantry battalions had been reduced to the size of understrength platoons. Panzer regiments had lost more than half their operational strength, not in glorious armored duels with American anti-tank guns or British tanks, but to the relentless, highly accurate plunging fire from the sea. The fertile fields and olive groves of the Salerno plain were violently pockmarked with thousands of overlapping massive craters, the earth scorched and churning from the continuous, uninterrupted delivery of heavy naval ordnance. The surviving German soldiers, severely demoralized by the unceasing bombardment and the utter inability to strike back against their tormentors, began to refer to the Allied naval guns in their diaries and letters as the Invisible Terror. The profound psychological toll of enduring days of random catastrophic explosions without the ability to seek effective cover or return fire shattered the combat cohesion of even the most experienced frontline units in the German army. Faced with the total collapse of his offensive capability and the very real, undeniable threat of his entire army being trapped and annihilated within the coastal mountains, General Vietinghoff was forced to make a bitter, humiliating strategic concession. He contacted Field Marshal Kesselring and officially reported that the objective of driving the Allies back into the sea was no longer militarily attainable. The unyielding umbrella of naval artillery had created an artificial, impenetrable fortress of explosive steel around the beachhead. With terribly heavy losses and his logistical lines severely disrupted by the ongoing bombardment, Vietinghoff ordered a phased tactical withdrawal. The 10th Army would disengage from the Salerno plain and retreat northward, fighting a slow, bitter delaying action through the highly defensible mountainous terrain of the Italian peninsula. The Grand Trap had definitively failed, and the Allies had successfully secured their vital strategic foothold on the European mainland. The Battle of Salerno stands as a profound historical testament to the decisive strategic impact of heavy naval gunfire support in modern amphibious operations. The German High Command, long recognized for their operational brilliance and tactical flexibility on the ground, had been entirely outmatched by the application of advanced naval gunnery physics and integrated electromechanical fire control networks. The terrifying realization that an entire heavy armored division could be halted, decimated, and ultimately forced to retreat by artillery platforms floating entirely out of sight over the horizon fundamentally altered how the German military planned defensive operations against future Allied landings. Never again would they willingly attempt to mass their heavy armor in the immediate coastal zones where the big guns of the cruisers and battleships could reach them and destroy them. The invisible fire that rained down upon the 16th Panzer Division at Salerno proved definitively that absolute control of the sea did not merely secure the vulnerable logistical supply lines, it provided a crushing, undeniable tactical mastery over the adjacent land, dictating the terms of engagement and fundamentally reshaping the very nature of continental warfare for the remainder of the conflict.